everybody. This is chapter 24. So imagine that there's only 2 left. I am starting to try and share my screen now. And here we go. So I'm sure you're excited that everything is almost done at this point. So let's talk a little bit about exercise in the environment. I just have to get the slideshow to play because clearly everything is thinking today. So exercise in the environment. We have to look at altitude as being something to consider. We know that atmospheric pressure decreases at higher altitudes. So we're going to see the same percentages of oxygen, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen in the air, but we're going to see a lower partial pressure of those same gases. So what we run into at altitude is a low PO2, so we become hypoxic. Normal PO2 is going to be sea level, and that's going to be things that we have to kind of consider. So if we're looking at a lower partial pressure of oxygen at altitude, should not really affect any short-term anaerobic performance, right? Because we don't necessarily care about that O2. And that lower air resistance may actually improve some performance. Long-term aerobic performance, we would see a negative impact there, depending on the oxygen delivery to the muscles. So what you'll see that in is different comparisons between the Olympics in Tokyo and Mexico City. That altitude will play a role in performance. So if we look at short-term races, pretty comparable, but a difference, all right, between places. When we look at long distance races, we're going to see a much bigger change when we look at going up in altitude. So Mexico City is going to be a higher elevation. So when we look at it, we talked about anaerobic performances maybe actually being better. We're going to see a new Olympic record in the long jump. When they divide out the calculations and they look at things, they're going to say that he had a 2.4 centimeter gain at the higher altitude, which when we're looking at world records is going to be a factor, but in real life activity, maybe not so much. So just recognize altitude may offer less resistance to high speed movement, but aerobically we may suffer. So what happens? We have a decreased VO2 max at higher altitude. We don't get as much oxygen out, okay? So when we really look at that, over 4,000 meters, we're gonna see a 27% lower VO2 max. That is going to be really, really comparable, not comparable, impactive, right, to performance. It's gonna leave a mark. If we're looking at things up to moderate altitudes, we might see that VO2 max decrease just based on arterial PO2 pressures. We're going to see at higher elevations that VO2 max reduction is also due to that cardiac output falling down. We're not going to be able to achieve the same maximal heart rate at altitude that we can not at altitude. So if you look at this and you can just watch it kind of creep up, Mexico City is a 74-foot elevation. I said 7,400, right? I had 100 to it. You're going to see Colorado at 10,200 feet, and Peru going up even higher. So you can see over that altitude how much we are going to see that anaerobic power output go down. All right. So altitude will elicit a higher heart rate, and we'll have to have more ventilation. I don't know if anybody's been to altitude. I I went to the mountains in New Mexico, actually, right after I was out of school. Considered actually taking a PT position there. And we just went on a general hike. I went with the owner of the practice. And I mean, we were not exerting ourselves, like full conversation. But like I could not catch my breath. It was like the weirdest sensation because like we're meandering. And I didn't anticipate it, but it is very hard to get your breath. So that not being at altitude, all of a sudden trying to perform at altitude, it'll make a big difference. So you can see this oxygen consumption with heart rate at sea level versus elevation. You can see how much more that heart rate has to increase. So look at this submax exercise. You'll see a general increase in ventilation. Even at just above sea level, less than 500 meters above, you're going to see some increase. But when we get to that, 5,800 meter, do you see how much more ventilation is going to need to occur? So how do we acclimate to that? We need to produce more red blood cells. So it'll counter that desaturation. It's the primary adaptation among those that live in the Andes, okay? We're gonna see greater oxygen saturation due to an increase in blood flow to the lungs. That's what happens in the Himalayas. We will see a lifetime altitude residents have complete adaptations. If we don't start out there at birth, we're not going to necessarily adapt as fully as if we started there. So what do we do about this when we're looking at competition? The effects of altitude on VO2 max vary among athletes, and that has to do with the saturation of hemoglobin. Some athletes can actually improve their VO2 max training at altitude, others not so much. Some of that might be, what training state we were in before we got there. So some athletes may carry that higher VO2 max down when they return to a low altitude, some do not. Part of that could be just a detraining effect. We came down. If we're at that higher altitude and we know that the cost of performing the activity is high, some of us might not necessarily be able to train the way we have been training. So some of that detraining is just we weren't able to be as intense at altitude as we would have been if we had just stayed down. So the best advice is live high but train low. So live at that high altitude. So we'll see some of those changes in red blood cell mass, increase that VO2 max. They look at it as you have to be at altitude more than 22 hours a day, and at least a 2,000 to 2,500 meter elevation required. And then we want to train at a lower altitude so that we can maintain that high intensity interval training. But living high should help boost all of that. Does the live high, train low increase performance at sea level? Some, not all. And we might see that as that crux on that elite athlete. That might be something that makes a difference for the better for them. So this is something that, coaches and trainers are going to debate, but there's not necessarily a clear answer. Some of that living high and training low avoids some of the negative effects of that prolonged altitude exposure, but we might not see anything detrimental. I think the biggest thing you have to look at is if you live low, but somehow you went to compete high and you had never been there before, that's probably where you see the biggest detriment on performance is your body doesn't know how to handle that. So if you look at, we had a girl several years ago for made it to nationals a couple times, and I can't remember if they were competing nationals in Colorado or New Mexico, or somewhere, wherever they were going, it was high elevation. And they were able to do it for it must have been indoor nationals. So the way it hit over kind of spring break. So they were able to extend their trip and get there a little early to have some adaptation and acclimation to altitude. When we look at Mount Everest, first successfully climbed in 1953, and they did have to use oxygen for the first time climbing it in 1978 without oxygen. So when we look at that, you can really see altitude and thinner air makes a difference. So if we start to look at this, you can see where we didn't get very high in the 30s. We finally hit that barrier of the summit in the 50s, but we had to use oxygen for a while to get there. So after they figured out that, they kind of started to work on how do we train, how do we get there. So you can see, just for trivia purposes, how much oxygen we can uptake, and that inspired pressure of oxygen over time. It's really kind of interesting to see how much we level off and how quickly. So what makes some people able to do it and some not? They have a capacity to hyperventilate, so they could drive down that PCO2 pressure and hydrogen in the blood and allow more oxygen to bind with hemoglobin at the same pressure. The biggest thing that you have to look at is they have to contend with the loss of appetite and reducing those type 1 and type 2 muscle fiber diameters. They just don't have the same capacity. So there's a little paradox here. We're going to consider that to be the lactate paradox. So when we're exposed to altitude, we have a higher heart rate, ventilation, and lactate during exercise because we're hypoxic, all right? After we start to acclimate, that lactate response is reduced, right? Even though we're still hypoxic, we get a little bit more used to it. Why does it happen? We can have lower plasma epinephrine, and the muscles might get smarter, right? They might adapt to it. Some studies observe this phenomenon, some don't. Some will argue that it doesn't even exist, but it's just something to look at. Heat. All right, so we talked about high. Now let's talk about heat. So hyperthermia is that elevated body temperature. What can go bad with heat? We can have some syncope, so some altered heart stuff. We can have heat cramps, heat exhaustion, may require medical attention. Heat stroke does require medical attention. How do we treat it? Best thing we can do is cold water immersion as the most rapid way to bring down that body temperature. If we look at it, syncope is fading. We might be really weak, nausea, headache. If we have that, first thing you do is go ahead and get some fluids in. Heat cramps are going to be spasming. Calf is usually a pretty common place to have it. Isolated, pressure, gently stretch, hydrate. If we're getting multiple cramps, then we're probably getting closer to that heat stroke. So we're going to try and treat it more like a heat exhaustion. So we'll see a ton of sweating in these guys, cold, clammy, pale, dizzy. Their pulse is going to become weak and rapid, not breathing real deeply. They feel like crap. They have a headache. They're nauseous. Maybe in and out of cognitive intact. So these are going to be, get them in a shock position, gently massage the extremities, move them around a little bit, definitely consume fluids. We have to really start looking at temperature here and monitoring things, and we should send them generally to a physician. If that progresses past heat exhaustion into heat stroke, we're going to see unresponsiveness. We're going to see labored breathing. There's going to be changes in behavior. Again, cool them down, get them in a shock position, and get to the hospital. Because, you know, if that core temperature keeps increasing, yeah, we're going to have lasting issues. If we're more fit, we're at a lower risk for heat injury, right? That just makes absolute sense. We're acclimated to the work in the heat. We sweat more. We try and shed some of that core temperature changes quicker. Less fit, going to struggle a little bit more. Can we acclimate to this? Sure. Exercising the heat for 10 to 14 days will start to put us into an adaptation form. So we'll see low intensity, long duration. We might see some moderate intensity, short duration exercises, altering some of those times. That's how we acclimate to the heat. What does our body do to make us better? Well, we're going to increase your plasma volume. So we have a greater capacity to sweat without becoming dehydrated. That'll increase our VO2 max, our max cardiac output, our lactate threshold, overall performance. It's going to lower our body temperature and heart rate response, and we're going to get a little bit better at keeping our sodium and not necessarily just losing it in our sweat. So acclimating, exercising for a good couple weeks in that environment is going to be our best protection against heat stroke and exhaustion. You know, what other factors do we have to keep in mind here? Hydration. If we have not adequately hydrated, we're going to be at a much more increased risk. No real difference between water electrolytes or carb electrolyte drinks. We just need to have drinks. Environmental temperatures. You know, we need to look at high temperatures will result in some heat gain. So what gradient do we have between the skin and the air to get rid of it? So those convection and radiation forces are going to kind of depend on that. The best thing we can do is expose as much skin as possible, or choose materials that are going to wick sweat away from the skin to try and allow that gradient between the skin and the air to blow it off. We know that humidity is a detriment. So that relative humidity is a good index of water vapor pressure. So then we have an idea of what we'll be able to get rid of. A metabolic rate, you know, your core temperature is proportional to your work rate. So if we're working much higher, then we're going to increase that metabolic heat production. And again, if windy will help with convection and evaporation. So we can get rid of it. So, you know, these are all the factors that really affect our heat injury and our ability to exercise through heat and without lasting issues. So here's just a pictorial of the things we've talked about. Excuse me. So uniforms. You know, I don't know how to stop it fast enough. Sorry. So exercising, right, and recovery. You know, if we're wearing a uniform, a pack, or just shorts, you can see how much other skin is exposed here. So you can see what kind of effect that has on core body temperature. So those are things to consider in recovery, as far as how quick we can bring that temperature back down. So biggest take-home messages here are: know what the signs and symptoms of a heat illness are. Try and exercise in the cooler part of the day. Get used to heat and humidity. If we, in the middle of the dead of winter and cold, fly to Florida and it's 95% humidity and 90 degrees out, and we decide to get up at 2:30 in the afternoon in the full sun and go run, probably going to do crappy. Okay. So being hydrated, exercising in the cooler part of the day, working up to it, making sure our clothing works best, are going to be huge. The other thing we have to do is we may have to monitor that heart rate and alter the exercise intensity to be able to do it better. So when we're looking at this, we have to look at preseason conditioning. We have to improve fitness, promote acclimation. It always cracks me up, but PIAA in the state of Pennsylvania always allows football to start before every other sport. so they can get acclimated to the heat. The only thing I think that makes a difference in why football might need more consideration is just the uniform. With the padding that they wear and the heaviness of the clothes, that's going to be a factor in what they can blow off. But you have cross country runners and you have them go out and run 10 miles, and we don't think they need to get acclimated to heat. It's just an interesting thing to me, but it is probably solely dependent on the uniforms. So safety wise, run at the cooler time of day, pay attention to the season of the year, make sure we're drinking water. And make sure, especially if you're working with a younger population, that they know what to expect, like what's happening. So this is just dependent, a way to calculate what the heat stress will be. So we look at a dry bulb temperature, so the temperature in the shade, then we look at in the direct sunlight, and then we have to look at the ability to evaporate sweat. And that'll give us a calculation of what we expect the overall heat stress to be. Again, depends on who we're working with, where we're working. So you can see those changes, that anything less than 50 degrees is going to be a risk of cold injury, whereas anything over 82 degrees is going to be a risk of too hot. And in that instance, we're looking at canceling or postponing an event. So you can see those extreme cautions, what high risk we have for the unfit or not acclimated. All right. Cold. All right. We talked about high, we talked about hot. Now let's talk about cold. Core temperature below 35 degrees. 2 degree drop Celsius is going to be where we shiver. 4 degree drop is going to be where we look drunk and are very generally apathetic. 6 degree drop in Celsius is going to be unconscious. Anything more, we're going to see ventricular fibrillation. We're going to see a decrease in blood flow to the brain. We're going to see the heart stop and death. So heat loss exceeds heat production. We have to maintain against heat loss. I remember reading a story about a South African runner who had transferred, I'm going to say, to the University of Alaska. Either way, he was in Alaska. Not dressed appropriately, went out for a run, got lost because, there's just a lot of snow and it all looks the same. Actually became hypothermic and died because he was so confused and not dressed for the weather. So those are things to really look at. Every year, sure, it's every year you read about some idiot who's drunk at the bar, who decides to walk home, isn't dressed appropriately, drunk, so confused, whatever, sits down for a minute, because they're tired and they're drunk, and they end up passing out and dying because of hypothermia, because they just didn't know, they were too cold. So things to really consider. I know that happened to somebody when I was in college back in my hometown. He was an adult. He was like 30 some. He's just going to walk home from the bar. Must have sat down and he didn't get back up. So keep that in mind. So what factors can affect this? Insulating factors. Are we in wet clothing? Are we in dry clothing? Do we have any cushioning, any subcutaneous fat to insulate? Gender and age are going to play a role. What kind of heat we can produce. What's the temperature? Are we in water or are we in air? Is there wind? You look at the three things you don't want to be outside. You don't want to be outside when it's cold. You don't want to be outside when it's windy. You don't necessarily want to be outside when it's wet. Any two of those things you can usually overcome. You add all three together and it becomes much, much more difficult. You don't want to be outside when it's wet. Wet and windy sucks, but if it's 95 degrees out and there's a breeze and you're wet, sucks, but not so bad. 40 degrees wet and windy, it becomes a much bigger issue. So just reflect on what are our conditions. So again, that gradient, if we're hotter than our environment, we have absolutely going to see some convective heat loss. Are we seeing anything that's going to increase our evaporation and lose it that way? Again, that wind chill index, what is the effective temperature? If it's super windy out, what is really happening to that heat loss? If we look at water, immersion in water is at a 25% increase in heat loss compared to air at the same temperature. So just recognize how fast you're going to lose that heat in water. So we talked about the humidity, heat index, looking at these wind chills. So if we start looking at, wind at, or temperature at 20 degrees, and we might have wind at 45 miles an hour, that is, instead of feeling like 20 degrees, it's going to feel like -1. Let's make it now -5 degrees Fahrenheit outside, and we add wind, just at 5 miles an hour. Now it's -16. We had 35-mile-an-hour wind and the temperature's -5. Now it's -34 degrees is the real feel. So within 10 minutes, you're going to hit frostbite. Okay. So when we start looking at, why school canceled, because they don't want kids standing on a bus if it's windy and below 0, because it just doesn't make sense. When we look at water temperature and survival, the warmer the water temperature is, the longer we can be exposed before we die. So if the water temperature is 60 degrees, we can probably survive 5 hours in that water. If that water is 25 degrees, we might make it 30 minutes. Okay. So again, it really will have a huge impact. If we're looking at fat, subcutaneous fat is effective and certainly more effective in cold water as far as maintaining some heat loss. Clothing, all clothing is a little bit different. If we're cold, we're wet, and we're windy, we're going to need more. And we certainly want it to be dry versus wet. If we're exercising, we might not need quite as much insulation to be required. They've gotten so much better at clothing, right? Neoprene and just looking at different things. You look at the old sleeping bags, like when I was a kid, it was the big, thick, cottonish, you froze your butt off. It was miserable. Then they started, making them with a covering, so you felt like a little bit more water resistant per se. Now sleeping bags are like super thin, but ridiculously effective. And a lot of that has to just do with technology and what we've done to improve that ability to maintain that heat. So again, what kind of material we need surrounding us for sleep. Okay. What happens with very light work? We need half as much material almost. Heavy work, 2 clothes for insulation versus sleep at 16. So really gives you a pretty good idea on the difference. So when we look at heat production increasing with exposure to cold, so we have an inverse relationship between VO2 max and body fatness, right? And generally, the more body mass we have, the less VO2 we have, right? So we're going to see in men, we might have an earlier onset of shivering. So you might see that in a fat man, they can maintain their resting VO2 and that core temperature a little bit better. Whereas you're going to see an increase in VO2 and a decrease in core temperature in thinner men. So remember that the fuel we use to shiver is primarily fat. So if we're shivering a lot, it can lead to muscle glycogen depletion. So let's keep that in mind. At rest, women show faster reduction in body temperature than men in cold water, a decrease in body temperature similar in men and women. So a lot of that has to do with body comp and how we're built. As soon as we hit the age of 60, we're going to be a little less tolerant to cold. And kids suck. Their temperature falls much faster in the cold. So what happens if we are starting to be affected by the cold? So hypothermia, we're going to see a reduction in coordination. We're going to see slurred speech. We're going to have impaired judgment, maybe make stupid decisions. Best thing you do is get them out of the cold, out of the wind, out of the rain, get all the wet clothing off, get some warm drinks on the inside and dry clothing, get them in a sleeping bag. If they are very semi-conscious or really out of it, another person generating heat in there with them will best. Find a source of heat, and again, prepare to evacuate and emergency medical services. Air pollution. Air pollution. So varieties of gases and particulates. It does have a detrimental effect on health and performance. So if the air is thick and smoggy, so we're going to see a decreased capacity to transport oxygen. We're going to see an increase in airway resistance. We're going to have an altered perception of effort. You know, how hard do we feel like we're working? So when we look at this dose is going to depend a little bit on what's the concentration in the air, how long are we exposed, how much air are we inhaling. Of course, we're going to be trying to move through more air if we're exercising. Those are all things to look at. So that particulate matter can promote infection. We can see a reduction in our ability to vasodilate, and we'll see an elevation in our blood pressure. So that oxidative stress and DNA damage is not helpful. If we see ozone issues, we're going to see a decrease in VO2 max and respiratory function. We're going to see an increase in inflammation. Anytime there's sulfur dioxide, it's going to cause a bronchial spasm in asthmatics, and carbon monoxide is going to reduce oxygen transport and will absolutely affect exercise and VO2 max. So air pollution, particulates, if you look around cities and you look at their air pollution, they'll have some charts and some things to look at to see effect. Beijing, when they had the Beijing Games, I'm pretty sure those were Summer Olympics. And they were even talking about it with Tokyo before, you know, the end time started. But some of the air pollution around those cities, they're really looking at what is that going to do to the marathon runners. You know, you're looking at a much larger dose and exposure. So most of the time at the Olympics, that marathon is done basically as soon as day breaks. You know, they've already started that race. So they can finish up before the humidity really jacks up and that pollution just kind of gets stuck there to try and help maintain the safety and the health of everybody involved. So here's just an effect of carbon monoxide on VO2 max. You can see it just keep going up. The higher that percentage particulate is, the worse it is. You know, what do we want to do? We want to reduce the exposure time. We want to stay away from bulbous amounts of pollutants, you know, smoking areas, high traffic areas, urban. You know, we do the New York City Marathon. We do it at a time of year where it's a little cooler and that kind of thing, but just the smog associated with that is not awesome. So they're going to say don't exercise during the most polluted parts of the day, that morning commute and that evening commute, right? And look at that air quality index. And I'll measure those 5 pollutants and give you an idea of what that air quality looks like. So, you know, it's kind of nice to be able to see it so people understand when they shouldn't necessarily exercise. So that gives you some considerations, things to think about, depending on where we are and what we're trying to accomplish. Again, all of us don't necessarily have the ability to, you know, live at altitude, train low, and see those kind of carryovers, but recognize all of that will have an effect. And it'll kind of depend on who you're working with and what kind of work you're doing. So there was 24.